How do you ruin a marriage? We are going to talk about so many ways to ruin a marriage and the opposite on today's episode of the What Could Go Right podcast. Hi, I am Emily Orton.
And I am Erik Orton.
And we talk about personal growth, family connection, and raising adult kids. And today we're talking about how to ruin a marriage.
Okay, so Emily, you and I did a gathering with couples, and we talked about double return parenting, and this is part of our double return parenting series, would you say? Mm-hmm. This is close to the beginning of it. If you want to catch the whole thing, go back and listen to the previous episode. But we asked this question to a group of couples in this very room that we're in right now, and
how do you ruin a marriage? The hands shot up. Everybody knew the answer, and there are so many
question.
good ones. Yeah, we know how to ruin a marriage. So here's what they said. Contempt, poor communication, being selfish, neglect, jealousy, control, lack of trust, neediness, backseat driving, that everyone had a story about that.
Ooh.
Cheating, nobody had a story.
Misaligned
shared. Priorities, shutting down, silent treatment, stonewalling, and criticism. And this is actually a design technique or an ideation technique where you, instead of saying what your goal is, you say the opposite. What would be a complete and utter failure, and how do we get to that? And then once you've listed out all of the ways to fail, or in this case, how to ruin a marriage, you can then go back and say, all right, well, we want to do the opposite of those things. And that's how we are going to have a marriage that is flourishing. So that was the technique that we were doing in this session, is first asking how to ruin a marriage.
Do we have their answers, or do we want to just try to go down this list and remember what the opposites are?
Yeah, we don't have what they wrote. We didn't write it down. We just looked at every answer that was here's how to ruin it, and then made something that was going to be the positive or the antonym, the opposite of that. So, for example, contempt. That would be kindness, right?
Or consideration, or generosity.
Courtesy, generosity. And so many of those words were coming up here, like good communication, being open, being humble, being receptive, listening, looking out for the good of the other person, being their fan, having their back. That was one of the phrases I really loved that came up. It was like, when you are in a good marriage, a thriving marriage that's flourishing, you know your partner has your back.
Do you want to share your contempt story now or later?
Well, this is actually a story about kindness, I think. So
the opposite of contempt.
When we were newly married and we were having our first child, we were at the hospital, actually sitting outside of the hospital. I was in labor. I wasn't having active contractions in the moment, but we were both a little nervous because we'd heard some horrible labor and delivery room stories about how couples were snapping at each other, or, the woman was yelling, or, things like that. And I didn't want to have that experience. We wanted to have a really unified, together, teamwork kind of good feelings experience. And there were a lot of things that I didn't know going into that first baby delivery. But we sat in our car outside the hospital and said a little prayer that we would be able to treat each other kindly through this whole process. And I thought that we did pretty well. But our
prayer was answered.
There was one moment where they wouldn't allow me to eat. Once you check in to have a baby, they don't let you eat. And then they still brought food. And so I was like, well, why don't you go ahead and eat it? Because you're not on any kind of restriction here, and I'll just enjoy this food. But for some reason, my sense of smell was heightened. And as I did go into active labor, it was induced. So it's maybe worse than, anyway, you don't need the whole birth stories. The point is, I was starting to feel a little bit annoyed either at the sound of Erik eating this muffin or the smell of this muffin. And I could feel the tension behind it. I tried to use kind words, but I was like, when is he going to finish that muffin, And he looked over, his eyes got really big, and he just popped the whole thing in his mouth. And anyway, I feel like it all turned out just fine, and we didn't have any real yelling at each other, and but it was just that we knew that contempt could come up in that situation, and we were like, we want to try to avoid that.
I love that I can show love to you through eating muffins.
I mean, thinking about it, I'm like, why didn't you just throw it in the garbage or something? But you're like, oh no, we're not wasting this muffin. It's like contrary to Erik's nature to waste food. So he wasn't gonna like stop.
No muffin should go
muffin.
uneaten. That's my mantra.
That's true. So anyway, that was one of the things that you can do is figure out what is not working and how can you do the opposite from that. And contempt is one of the fastest ways to ruin a marriage, to break trust, to close down communication, to increase your selfishness. Like, it is the gateway drug to so many of these other problems that can come up to ruin a marriage. So you were going to share one of yours.
Okay, so my weakness is backseat driving. My kids know, and Emily knows, that I am not a great passenger.
Please share this with any of your loved ones who is not a great backseat passenger.
So we just sort of have a standing rule. If we're going anywhere, I'll drive. Not because Emily's not a good driver, but because I'm a terrible passenger. And so
That's love.
Hey, and that's love. So we were driving across country, and we were making tracks. We were doing it fast. We had all of our kids with us, and so
all 5. And I think we were trying to get to a solar eclipse.
Yeah, we were trying to get to Idaho in time for a solar eclipse. So we were moving fast, and we were basically driving nonstop. And I had been pulling a long shift, and finally I was getting a little bit loopy. And we'd pulled into a Wendy's and decided to get Frosties. But right before we had gotten something to eat across the street. And then I was like, I can't drive anymore.
We stopped for gas, and then we're like, now we're going to go get Frosties.
And one of our daughters got in the driver's seat, and she was now in charge of the vehicle. And I was going to go all the way to the back row of our minivan and sit in the corner in the back and just try and sleep. And so Allison was driving, and she's a great driver, and she's getting us across the intersection to the drive-through. And all of a sudden, I had all these opinions, and I was like, "No, don't go this way. You need to go around this way and turn sharper so that you don't hit." And I was like, all of a sudden, from the back row, I was legitimately trying to drive the car from the back corner. And finally, our kids were just like, "Stop it, Dad! Stop trying."
Well, I think they started laughing because they were like, "You cannot. You just said I don't want to make any more decisions. I'm just going to go back here and sleep." And immediately popped up with all kinds of opinions. They were like laughing. They were like, "Dad, I thought you weren't going to make any more decisions."
I'm lucky that I have kids that can have a sense of humor about my weaknesses. But I'll say this. So anyway, the message landed with me, and I shut my trap when we got the Frosties, and we obviously made it across the country just fine without me trying to drive the whole way. But imagine in a marriage if you're the spouse that is always trying to tell your spouse how to do things, and poor Emily, she knows that she bears the brunt of this because I have a lot of opinions on how things should be done, and all of them happen to be right. and she just has to bear with my obstinance. And so this is an area where it's a known issue. And so we speak to it and we address it. But, something like this, you get enough of these and you let them grow big enough and you pile them on top of each other. And that's how you ruin a marriage. And so we're slowly trying to reduce our behaviors in these areas.
I will say, I don't know if it was a known issue when we got married because we didn't have a car. We couldn't afford a car. We got married. We were married for like a year before we got a car.
We had a bicycle.
That's when it emerged. But I'm just teasing you. But it does remind me of a line from Much Ado About Nothing where I think it's the sheriff is saying to the governor or something. He says like, "I bestow all of my tediousness upon you." Yes. And we love to use that line every now and again to kind of tease each other when we have lots of opinions or about
Yeah,
something. I bestow all of my tediousness.
It was the Michael Keaton's line.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So that's funny. Anyway, okay. I would be happy to share this story with you also about jealousy. And I have had a struggle with jealousy for most of my life. And certainly in my dating years, it did me no favors. And I thought I had made a lot of progress in it before we got married. And I did, but the stakes are also higher and there's more opportunities for jealousy in marriage. And so that has been something that you have borne the brunt of. I bestowed all of my tediousness upon you because I would come forward with jealous questions or jealous fears or jealous comments. And that is a great way to break trust, because at the end of the day, underneath of it is just this fear of abandonment. And I had, again, I feel like this was sort of a miracle for me, but it wasn't until 2018. It was 2019, and we were in New Zealand, and I had been doing pretty well, but something came up, something very small, and I felt jealous about it. I felt like maybe you were putting somebody else in front of me, and you were like, I don't think that's what's happening. And I was very upset, and I was just praying about it, and I was like, how can this ever be resolved? Like, I always have these feelings, and to me, it felt like a hole in a bucket that could never be patched, and so the bucket could never be filled. And as I was praying, and we'd been married over 20 years at this point, I felt like I was looking at a story of my life, and two of the pages were stuck together. And in my mind, these pages became unstuck, and I was able to see for the first time, truly, a piece of the story that I had been missing, which I had always been aware of competing distractions, for your attention. And in this new version of the story, what I saw is that for every obstacle that might come up, you were always fighting to get around that obstacle or through that obstacle or over that obstacle to connect with me. And that's when I realized, oh, there's not a hole in this bucket. I didn't see the whole story. And I saw your true devotion, and I felt so grateful to be relieved of that. It really did go away in a moment. I told Eric, I'm not jealous anymore, but you don't have to believe me. Like, just wait. And now it's been several years, and it has stuck, right? Like, it was a true transformation in that moment of understanding and recognizing a new story. So I know that jealousy was one of the thorns in our side in our marriage, and that was something that we were constantly working on, and that was a major transformation. So there is something that I want to say here, though, that we didn't talk about beforehand, and Eric had mentioned how when some little thing piles up or compounds, you get this negative interest, right? Like the bad kind of, it's like a relationship debt or something that builds up till it becomes overwhelming and you declare bankruptcy and get out. The same thing can happen for good, as little beautiful memories and kind words and those things like pile up and compound over time. That is, your love bank that is all full. The other metaphor I like to use is as a garden, and so that we don't let these little things pile up, because it's not that we never have contempt or selfishness or like backseat, like we have, or a desire to control. Like, all of those things emerge, and what we like to do is look at it like a garden and say, let's address it right away. There are some weeds cropping up, and we need to weed. It's time to weed this garden, and that way nothing ever becomes too overwhelming. Nothing ever overtakes us, and we're able to let those beautiful feelings and experiences grow that help our marriage flourish, and identify and praise and compliment those things and focus on them and help them grow. But we also do tend to these weeds and try to get to them while they're small. We don't believe in this concept of quote unquote keeping the peace, of not saying anything not confronting something, because the longer you wait, the harder it is. We try not to kick the can down the road. Have I used enough metaphors? Hopefully
Lots
one of
of
these
good
works.
metaphors.
Hopefully one of these works for you, and will give you the courage to say, oh, that we need to weed our garden. This is totally normal that this is happening. There's nothing wrong with me. There's nothing wrong with you. And we are going to choose to weed this garden and put the water and other good resources into a flourishing marriage, because the grass is always greenest where you water it.
I'll say this. Because we've been going through our first year and change of home ownership, and we bought this house that was a real fixer-upper, and there was a lot of back maintenance, I'll say, to get it to a place that we were happy with. We did a lot of heavy lifting early on, both inside the house and I'll say outside, just sort of like the outdoor spaces, since you're talking about weeding the garden.
Yeah.
And here's the good news about weeding the garden, is that when it happens regularly, it's really easy. When you let it go for a long stretch or a season or two, then it turns into a pain point, and it requires heavy lifting. And then you've got to get out big tools and make big moves to make things happen. But honestly, every day we go for a walk, I come back and I kind of glance around the yard and I was like, oh, plunk, plunk, plunk. And in 90 seconds, 2 minutes, whatever, anything that started to grow that we don't want there, we're able to just pull it out, and in one hand, I throw it in the bin, and it's done. Mm-hmm. It gets easy when we do it regularly. When we neglect it and let it go, that's when it becomes a real burden and a weight.
I love that you mentioned that. It makes me think of, for many years in our marriage, we used a tool called a couple council agenda. And you can call it whatever you want. Like, please feel free to submit your name suggestions. Anyway, but the point
the weekly
is...
make-out meeting?
What? Okay. That's
Anyway.
important. We had this meeting that we would get together every week. It had a time limit, so it was never going to be for more than 30 minutes, and it could certainly be shorter than that, because it doesn't take long if you're meeting every week. And in it, we would just address certain topics like, how are each of our kids doing? How are we doing extended family? Is there anything we need to be aware of? And like a little bit of calendaring. And we would also always make sure that we talked about our romantic life, and so that there was always a forum where ideas or questions or whatever it might be could be discussed, and it wasn't like, oh, we have to make us like, when am I going to bring this up, that this isn't working for me or that this is working for me. And I just feel like it allowed us to just like have so much peace and confidence in all the areas of our life, because we knew, oh, we're going to touch base on this, essentially like weed the garden or tend the garden on a weekly basis. And we didn't have to, like, for example, as far as our romantic life, we never were like waiting many months or years to kind of broach a subject, like because it was too tender or too vulnerable. It just got us in a really good habit of communicating about those things on a regular basis. And so, you can just use that outline or adapt it to yourself. And I do recommend, though, if you're interested in having a regular meeting like this with your spouse, or gathering up or chat or whatever you want to call it that doesn't make it feel too formal or intimidating, is do have a time limit on it so you know what you're in for. Made all the difference.
Do you mind if I double back and kind of recap some of the things we talked
go ahead.
about? So if you're struggling in your marriage and you want it to be better, make a list of all the things that can ruin your marriage or are ruining your marriage. And then, as Emily talked about this design technique, just flip it and say, okay, if those are the things that are ruining my marriage or could ruin my marriage, what's the opposite? And how do I, not your spouse, how do I start to do those things in my marriage? And it will make a big difference. And Emily and I really believe that whether your kids are married or they're going to be married, if you live and create the kind of marriage that you wish on your kids, you get the double return. You get to enjoy a happy, beautiful, harmonious marriage. and you're modeling it for your kids, and they're going to get the benefit of seeing how it can be done so that it makes it that much easier for them. And so if your kids are married and you just live the marriage that you wish on your kids. Anything else you'd say about
I
that?
think that's a really good guideline. If you, not to add additional pressure on you or be like, if I don't have a good marriage, my kids won't have a good marriage, but just say like, they are going to learn more by example than they are going to be by you telling them things. And if you can show them, this is how we apologize in our house, and this is how we compliment, and this is how we have each other's back, then they're going to be like, oh, that's what a resilient relationship looks like. We're not going for a perfect, never have an argument, never disagree, never disappoint each other or hurt each other's feelings. That's not realistic. That's not true. But if you say like, we have our ups and downs and we focus on our ups and our ups keep getting higher, then that is a great thing for your kids to aim for. So I love that as a guideline, that I want to live in the kind of marriage that I would wish on my kids. That's everything for me. If you had anything else to add, I'd love to hear it. Okay, that's all for this episode. Thanks so much for joining us on the What Could Go Right podcast. We hope lots of things will go right for you in your marriage.
Hey there, it's Erik. How would you like to travel for a month with your entire family anywhere in the world without quitting your job? I'd love to show you how. That's how Emily and I and our 5 kids started. We would just do these 1-month trips that eventually grew to living on a sailboat, including our daughter with special needs. Once we started to do this, we felt like we just found the cheat code for life, and we'd love to share it with you. So this is what we do. It's called a discovery call. You book a time for 20, 30 minutes. It's free. We're going to go over 3 questions, and when we do this, you're going to be able to launch your first of many, hopefully, family adventures. Does not require you to quit your job. All you got to do is go to theawesomefactory.nyc/discovery, pick a time that works for you, and we'll get on and we'll get you going. Why do I do these for free? Because everyone deserves to know what's possible in their life, including you. So, love to see you there. Thanks.